What if I told you that the financial undoing of one of history's greatest empires was meticulously orchestrated by a single Jewish banking dynasty? And what if their motive was centuries of relentless persecution? I'm talking about the Russian Empire, a colossal territory spanning 11 time zones, encompassing 1/6 of the Earth's land. This empire boasted the largest army in Europe, possessed seemingly limitless natural resources, and held dominion over 130 million souls. The Romanov dynasty had weathered the Napoleonic Wars, suppressed countless revolutions, and shaped European politics for 3 centuries. To truly understand the scale of what the Warburgs were dismantling, we must look at an empire that had outgrown its own borders. By the 19th century, the Romanovs didn't just rule a landmass, they were a global force. They had established colonies in Alaska and California, and in 1820, a Russian expedition had even reached the shores of Antarctica. They were building the Trans-Siberian Railway, a 300-kilometer steel spine connecting Moscow to the Pacific. This was the world number one that was being systematically pushed toward ruin. History has a bone-chilling way of coming full circle. In 1613, the first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail, accepted the crown at the Ipatiev Monastery in Kostroma. Fast forward 305 years to 1918, and the very last Tsar, Nicholas II, would meet his brutal end in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. A dynasty born in Ipatiev was destined to die in Ipatiev, as if the shadow of fate had been waiting for 3 centuries to close the book. Yet, between 1904 and 1917, this seemingly invincible empire was systematically brought to its knees through financial maneuvers so intricate that many historians still struggle to grasp their full scope. The masterminds behind this economic devastation weren't rival nations or armies of revolutionaries. They were members of the Warburg banking dynasty, a German Jewish family who had been plotting their revenge against Russian anti-Semitism for over half a century. Nicholas II was rich on paper, but poor in cash. Despite his 24 million gold ruble allowance, his obsession with imperial grandeur, like the $2,000 jeweled gifts from Fabergé, created an internal vacuum. By every autumn, he was penniless, forced to beg for the very foreign credit lines the Warburgs were systematically engineering to control him. This internal vacuum made the Romanovs even more susceptible to the very foreign credit lines the Warburgs were engineered to control. The fall was also heralded by a dark spiritual warning. Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk who held the empress in his thrall, left a terrifying ultimatum. If he were killed by the Tsar's relatives, no member of the imperial family would live longer than 2 years. When Prince Felix Yusupov murdered Rasputin in December 1916, he didn't realize he was triggering a countdown. 19 months later, Rasputin's bloody prophecy was fulfilled in that Yekaterinburg cellar. Even Rasputin's bloody ultimatum wasn't just a monk's warning. It was the final symptom of a leadership that had lost its grip on reality. Just as it had lost its grip on its gold reserves, operating through a web of banks spanning 3 continents, the Warburg family executed the most elaborate financial assault in history. They manipulated bond markets, controlled currency exchanges, and coordinated international credit flows, gradually suffocating the Russian economy while amassing enormous profits. To understand the scale of this operation, we must realize that the Warburgs weren't just bankers. They were the invisible architects of a global financial siege. This was the first historical blueprint of economic sanctions, long before the term was even invented. By coordinating capital flows across New York, London, and Hamburg, they didn't need to fire a single bullet to cripple an empire. They simply controlled the ledger of international credit, effectively outsourcing the destruction of the Russian economy. But this wasn't simply about monetary gain. The Warburg family's vendetta against the Russian Empire was deeply personal. For generations, their kin had been subjected to pogroms, forced displacements, and systematic persecution under Russia's anti-Semitic policies. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had perished within Russian territories, with millions more driven into poverty and exile. When Max Warburg finally possessed the power to retaliate, his aim extended beyond merely defeating the Russian Empire. He sought its utter destruction, ensuring it could never again pose a threat to Jewish communities worldwide. But the Warburg family's retribution was only beginning. The financial infrastructure they had constructed to dismantle Imperial Russia would lay the groundwork for a new form of global power, capable of manipulating the economies of entire nations. This is the saga of how one Jewish family's quest for vengeance against Russian anti-Semitism irrevocably altered the course of world history. Let's journey back to an era where anti-Semitism wasn't mere prejudice. It was enshrined as official government policy, dictating life and death for millions. To understand Max's fury, we must understand the pogrom's state-sponsored ethnic cleansing through coordinated mobs funded by the Tsar's government. The scale of the brutality was horrifying. In Kiev, over 2,000 Jewish homes were razed in 3 days. In Odessa, Jewish businesses were systematically torched while police stood idly by. But the physical violence was merely the opening act. The new Russian government enacted a series of legal restrictions designed to economically cripple Jewish communities throughout the empire. This leads us to the most lethal technique in high finance, the concept of transactional leverage. In the world of the elite, you don't pick a side, you own the system that funds both sides. By simultaneously lending to the Tsar and funding the revolutionaries, the banking network ensured a win-win scenario. Whether the empire survived or the revolution succeeded, the winner would always remain a debt slave to the bank. Jews were barred from owning land outside designated areas, excluded from most professions, prohibited from attending universities, and subjected to discriminatory taxes that rendered normal business operations impossible. The Pale of Settlement effectively became a giant open-air prison. Imagine a restricted territory where 5 million people were legally crammed into overcrowded ghettos, stripped of their right to own land or move freely, turning their ancestral homes into a vast concentration camp. What many fail to appreciate about the Warburg family is that they were more than just prosperous bankers. They were part of a sophisticated network of Jewish financial institutions that had been evolving across Europe for centuries. These banks were not merely commercial enterprises. They were vital mechanisms that enabled Jewish communities to maintain economic stability in the face of constant persecution from Christian governments. The Warburg Bank in Hamburg was interconnected with Rothschild operations in London, Loeb in New York, and scores of smaller Jewish banking houses throughout Europe and America. These institutions shared information, coordinated investments, and provided financial succor to Jewish communities facing persecution anywhere in the world. However, the Russian pogroms of the 1880s represented a departure from the customary pattern of European anti-Semitism. This was not simply localized persecution that could be managed through careful political maneuvering or strategic financial aid. This was a systematic government campaign aimed at eradicating Jewish communities entirely from one of the world's largest empires. Traditional Jewish survival strategies proved inadequate in addressing this level of organized persecution. Diplomatic appeals to European governments yielded nothing, as most European leaders were either indifferent to Jewish suffering or actively supported Russia's anti-Semitic policies. Economic pressure exerted through traditional banking channels was ineffective because Russian markets were too vast and too isolated for conventional financial leverage to have a significant impact. Max Warburg understood that halting Russian persecution would necessitate a new form of financial warfare, far exceeding anything Jewish communities had previously attempted. Rather than merely safeguarding Jewish assets or providing emergency assistance to persecuted communities, Jewish banking houses would need to actively work to weaken and ultimately dismantle the Russian government's capacity to continue its anti-Semitic policies. This realization marked the genesis of one of the most elaborate financial conspiracies in human history. Beginning in the 1890s, Max Warburg began collaborating with other Jewish banking families to devise strategies for systematically undermining Russian economic stability while constructing alternative power structures that could safeguard Jewish communities from future persecution. The plan was extraordinarily ambitious, exceeding anything private financial institutions had ever attempted. Rather than merely competing with Russian businesses or avoiding Russian markets, Jewish banking houses would actively strive to bankrupt the Russian government by manipulating international credit markets, controlling access to foreign investment, and coordinating economic pressure that could compel political changes throughout the Russian Empire. However, the strategy also demanded exceptional patience and sophisticated planning, requiring decades to implement effectively. A precipitous Russian economic collapse could trigger military responses that would only exacerbate persecution. The financial pressure needed to be applied gradually, in a manner that appeared to be driven by natural market forces rather than a coordinated assault by Jewish institutions. Crucially, the plan required the construction of alternative economic and political structures to fill the power vacuum that would inevitably result from Russia's economic collapse. Jewish communities could not simply destroy the existing system. They needed to ensure that whatever replaced it would be more conducive to Jewish interests and less prone to implementing systematic persecution. The complexity of this strategy reflected the lessons Jewish communities had gleaned from centuries of persecution under various European governments. Simply reacting to immediate threats was insufficient for long-term survival. Jewish communities needed to cultivate the kind of structural power that could preempt persecution before it began. Max Warburg's generation possessed access to financial resources and international networks that previous generations of Jewish leaders could only dream of. The Industrial Revolution had spawned vast new opportunities for international banking and investment, enabling unprecedented levels of wealth creation for institutions that understood how to exploit these opportunities effectively. More importantly, the growing intricacy of international finance meant that sophisticated financial institutions could influence government policies in ways that remained imperceptible to the general public, and even to most government officials. Currency manipulations, bond market operations, and credit arrangements could generate economic pressures that forced political shifts without necessitating overt political advocacy that might invite further persecution. By 1900, Max Warburg had dedicated over a decade to building the financial networks necessary for a sustained economic war against the Russian Empire. Jewish banking houses across Europe and America were coordinating their activities in unprecedented ways. Information networks were sharing intelligence about Russian economic vulnerabilities, and investment strategies were being aligned to maximize pressure on Russian financial stability. The Russian government remained largely oblivious to the coordinated financial threat posed by Jewish institutions. Russian officials recognized their need for foreign investment to modernize their economy and maintain their military strength, but they failed to grasp that the foreign banks they were engaging with had compelling reasons to desire the weakening or even the destruction of the Russian Empire. This lack of awareness would prove to be a fatal vulnerability. Over the ensuing 2 decades, Russia's dependence on foreign credit would swell to levels that rendered the empire virtually reliant on the very Jewish banking institutions that were actively working to dismantle it. The stage was set for financial warfare on a scale the world had never witnessed. The Warburg banking dynasty's war against the Russian Empire commenced not with grand financial strategies, but with a 13-year-old boy watching his grandfather count coins in a cramped Hamburg warehouse in 1867. Max Warburg's introduction to international banking came through family stories that illuminated how Jewish survival had always hinged on maintaining financial networks capable of operating across borders and beyond the reach of hostile governments. The Warburg family had been money changers and traders for over 3 centuries. However, their business model was not solely about generating profits. It was about forging financial lifelines that could shield Jewish communities from the constant threat of persecution, exile, and economic ruin. The original Warburg Bank was established in 1798 by 2 brothers, Moses, Marcus Warburg, and Gerson Warburg, who recognized that Jewish communities needed financial institutions that could function independently of Christian banking networks. Traditional European banks were closed to Jewish customers, and Jewish merchants faced persistent restrictions on their business activities, rendering conventional commercial relationships virtually impossible. What distinguished the early Warburg operations from other Jewish banking houses was their systematic emphasis on international relationships that could offer alternatives to local economic opportunities. While most Jewish businesses remained confined to specific cities or regions where they had managed to secure political protection, The Warburg family cultivated networks that connected Jewish communities across multiple countries and continents. By 1850, Warburg operations extended from Hamburg to London, from Vienna to New York, creating financial pathways that allowed Jewish merchants and investors to move money and conduct business regardless of local political conditions. These networks were not merely convenient. They were essential for Jewish economic survival in a world where government policies could extinguish Jewish business opportunities overnight. Max Warburg's childhood education reflected this understanding of banking as a form of community defense. Rather than learning conventional business practices focused on maximizing profits from individual transactions, he was taught to think strategically about how financial relationships could create long-term security for Jewish communities facing constant political uncertainties. These lessons were reinforced by family stories about previous generations of Jewish families who had lost everything when they became overly reliant on local political relationships that could be overturned by new governments or shifting religious sentiments. The Warburg family had endured for centuries by maintaining a degree of financial independence that could not be undone by any single government's policies. However, Max's generation faced challenges that previous Warburg bankers had never encountered. The Industrial Revolution was creating opportunities for wealth accumulation on scales that individual families had never possessed. But it was also empowering governments to implement persecution more systematically and efficiently than ever before. The Russian Empire represented both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity that Jewish banking families had ever confronted. Russia controlled vast territories with millions of Jewish residents, and Russian anti-Semitic policies impacted Jewish communities far beyond Russian borders. Yet, Russia was also increasingly reliant on foreign investment for economic modernization, creating opportunities for foreign banks to exert influence over Russian policies through financial pressure. Max Warburg's formal banking education commenced in 1885 when he was 18 years old, and the full scope of Russian anti-Semitic persecution was becoming evident to Jewish communities throughout Europe. Rather than attending conventional German business schools that focused on traditional European banking practices, Max was sent to work with Jewish banking houses in London and New York that specialized in international operations. His initial assignment involved managing investments for Jewish refugees fleeing Russian persecution and seeking to rebuild their lives in Western Europe and America. This work provided Max with first-hand exposure to the human cost of Russian anti-Semitic policies and the financial challenges faced by Jewish communities when forced to abandon their businesses and start anew in foreign lands. More importantly, the refugee assistance work revealed patterns in how Russian persecution operated and how it could potentially be disrupted through sophisticated financial intervention. Russian anti-Semitic policies were not random expressions of religious prejudice. They were systematic government strategies designed to achieve specific economic and political objectives that could be undermined if Jewish communities possessed sufficient financial leverage. The key insight that would shape Max Warburg's entire career stemmed from analyzing how Russian persecution affected different types of Jewish community. Wealthy Jewish families who had diversified their assets internationally could typically evade Russian persecution by relocating to other countries. Impoverished Jewish families who depended on local economic opportunities had no recourse when Russian policies decimated their sources of income. However, middle-class Jewish communities, merchants, professionals, and small business owners who possessed significant local investments but limited international connections represented the most vulnerable population and consequently the primary target for Russian persecution. These communities possessed skills and resources that Russian authorities sought to eliminate, but they lacked the wealth to simply relocate when persecution intensified. Russian anti-Semitic policies were designed to dismantle these middle-class Jewish communities by eliminating their economic opportunities while preventing them from amassing the resources needed to flee to other countries. The strategy systematically converted productive Jewish families into desperate refugees who could be expelled from Russian territories without significant economic loss to the Russian government. Max Warburg realized that protecting these vulnerable Jewish communities would necessitate disrupting the economic foundations that made Russian persecution profitable for the Russian government, as long as anti-Semitic policies generated economic benefits for Russian authorities. It was believed would continue their persecution of Jewish people regardless of diplomatic pressure or moral appeals from European governments. The solution, therefore, lay in reframing the issue not merely as a religious or political one, but as an economic problem. Russian anti-Semitism was more than just prejudice. It functioned as a business model, generating profits for the authorities through the confiscation of Jewish assets, the elimination of Jewish business competition, and the redirection of Jewish economic productivity to serve Russian government priorities. Disrupting this lucrative model required Jewish banking institutions to develop financial strategies that would make anti-Semitic policies economically costly rather than beneficial for Russian authorities. Instead of solely safeguarding Jewish assets from confiscation, Jewish banks needed to actively work to make Russian persecution financially disadvantageous for the Russian government itself. This approach marked a significant departure from traditional Jewish survival strategies, which had focused on maintaining a low profile, cultivating political relationships with sympathetic officials, and avoiding actions that might incite further persecution. Max Warburg was proposing that Jewish communities actively fight back against persecution, employing financial weapons capable of inflicting real economic damage on hostile governments. This strategy demanded unprecedented coordination among Jewish banking institutions, which had historically operated as independent businesses, primarily serving their own local communities. Success hinged on Jewish banks throughout Europe and America sharing information, coordinating investment strategies, and subordinating individual business interests to collective goals aimed at protecting Jewish communities from systematic persecution. Building such coordination would require years of careful relationship building and trust development between banking families with limited experience working together on projects extending beyond immediate commercial opportunities. The Warburg family's extensive international connections provided a foundation for such coordination, but converting business relationships into political alliances demanded new levels of commitment and risk acceptance. Throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s, Max Warburg traveled extensively throughout Europe and America, building the network of Jewish banking relationships essential for sustained financial warfare against Russian anti-Semitism. His meetings transcended mere business negotiations. They were political organizing sessions designed to forge consensus around strategies that individual banking houses could not implement independently. The resistance he encountered highlighted the stark contrast between his proposed approach and traditional Jewish survival strategies. Many established Jewish banking families were reluctant to jeopardize their businesses in political conflicts that might trigger persecution in their own countries. They had achieved success and security by avoiding political controversy, and they feared that financial attacks on the Russian government might provoke anti-Semitic reactions in Germany, France, Britain, or America. These concerns were not unfounded. Jewish communities throughout Europe remained politically vulnerable despite their growing economic influence. Governments that currently tolerated or protected Jewish businesses might reverse their policies if they perceived Jewish banking institutions as political threats rather than simply commercial enterprises. However, Max Warburg argued that traditional strategies of political accommodation were no longer viable given the scale and systematic nature of Russian persecution. The Russian Empire was too large and influential to ignore, and its anti-Semitic policies were inspiring similar movements in other countries, threatening Jewish security throughout Europe. More importantly, the growing international influence of Jewish banking institutions presented opportunities to influence government policies that previous generations of Jewish leaders had never possessed. Rather than simply reacting to persecution after it occurred, Jewish banks could proactively prevent it by making anti-Semitic policies economically disadvantageous for governments to implement. By 1895, Max Warburg had successfully forged preliminary agreements with Jewish banking houses in London, Paris, Vienna, and New York for coordinated financial operations designed to pressure the Russian government to change its anti-Semitic policies. These agreements were not formal treaties, but rather understandings between family businesses sharing a common interest in protecting Jewish communities from systematic persecution. The network was still fragile and limited in scope, but it represented something unprecedented in Jewish history: a coordinated international organization with substantial financial resources specifically designed to fight back against anti-Semitic persecution rather than simply accommodating it. The critical question was whether this network could develop the sophisticated financial strategies needed to inflict meaningful damage on an empire as large and powerful as Russia, without triggering even worse persecution for Jewish communities still vulnerable to Russian retaliation. The answer would determine not just the fate of Russian Jewish communities, but the future of Jewish survival strategies throughout the world. By 1897, Max Warburg had dedicated 3 years to building international alliances. However, he was about to discover that bankrupting the Russian Empire would require penetrating the heart of Russian financial operations in ways that no foreign banking institution had ever attempted. The opportunity arose from an unexpected source: Russian military incompetence in the Far East, which created financial pressures that the Tsarist government couldn't manage through its traditional domestic banking relationships. Russia's expansion into Manchuria and its escalating conflict with Japan over Korean territories were consuming enormous military resources, straining the empire's financial capacity beyond its ability to generate revenue through conventional taxation or domestic borrowing. The Russian government desperately needed massive foreign loans to sustain its military operations. However, securing such loans required convincing foreign investors that Russian bonds represented secure investments. Despite the obvious evidence of Russian military and administrative incompetence, this financial vulnerability created precisely the opening that Max Warburg had been seeking. Instead of attacking Russian economic interests from the outside through boycotts or competitive business practices, Jewish banking institutions could potentially gain direct influence over Russian financial operations by becoming essential partners in Russian government financing. The strategy was both brilliant and dangerous. By providing the foreign credit that Russia desperately needed, Jewish banks could gradually gain control over Russian economic policy while generating enormous profits from high-interest government bonds. However, the same relationships that provided leverage over Russian policy also created exposure to Russian retaliation. If the government discovered that Jewish institutions were deliberately manipulating Russian finances to undermine Russian power, Max Warburg's entry into Russian government financing began through his partnership with the Rothschild banking network, which had maintained limited business dealings with Russian authorities for several decades. The Rothschilds possessed established relationships with Russian financial officials and experience with international government bond operations, essential for accessing Russian markets. However, they lacked the systematic political motivation that drove Warburg family planning. The collaboration allowed both banking families to pursue their objectives more effectively than either could achieve independently. The Rothschilds gained access to Warburg expertise in coordinated international financial operations, while the Warburg family gained access to Russian government relationships that had taken the Rothschilds decades to establish. Their first major joint operation involved underwriting $50 million in Russian government bonds, ostensibly designed to fund railroad construction in Siberia, but actually needed to finance Russian military operations in Manchuria. The bond issue was structured to appear beneficial to Russian interests while actually creating financial obligations that would ultimately transfer real economic control from Russian authorities to the foreign banking institutions managing Russian debt. The key innovation involved using complex currency exchange arrangements that nominally protected Russian gold reserves while actually making those reserves vulnerable to manipulation by foreign creditors controlling international currency markets. Russian authorities believed they were borrowing foreign currency to fund domestic development projects, but the loan terms actually required Russia to maintain gold reserves that could be influenced by the same banking institutions that had provided the original loans. This currency manipulation mechanism would become the foundation for all subsequent Warburg operations in Russian markets. By controlling the exchange rates between Russian rubles and foreign currencies, Jewish banking institutions could influence the real cost of Russian government operations, the value of Russian international trade, and ultimately, the stability of Russian government finances. However, implementing this strategy required establishing permanent operations within Russian territory, capable of monitoring Russian financial conditions and coordinating with foreign banking networks in real time. Max Warburg couldn't manage sophisticated currency manipulation from Hamburg. He needed representatives in St. Petersburg who could track Russian government activities and implement financial operations that appeared to be routine business transactions. The solution involved establishing Warburg subsidiary operations in St. Petersburg that appeared to be standard foreign banking branches serving the needs of international commerce, but were actually intelligence and coordination. Volunteers for the systematic financial warfare campaign against Russian economic stability. The St. Petersburg office was staffed primarily by Jewish bankers and financial specialists who had fled Russian persecution and possessed both the language skills and cultural knowledge needed to operate effectively within Russian society. These individuals had personal motivations for undermining Russian power that aligned perfectly with Warburg family objectives, and their refugee backgrounds provided cover for their actual activities. From the outside, the Warburg St. Petersburg operation appeared to be a standard international banking office that facilitated trade between Russian businesses and foreign markets. They provided currency exchange services, managed international payments, and offered commercial credit to Russian merchants needing financing for international transactions. However, the real purpose of the St. Petersburg office was gathering intelligence about Russian government financial conditions and coordinating that information with Jewish banking operations throughout Europe and America. Every transaction provided data about Russian economic performance. Every government interaction revealed information about Russian policy planning. Every commercial relationship created opportunities for influencing Russian business decisions. The intelligence network that emerged from these operations was remarkable in its scope and sophistication. By 1900, Jewish banking institutions possessed better information about Russian economic conditions than most Russian government officials. They knew which Russian government departments were facing budget shortfalls, which Russian businesses were struggling with debt obligations, and which Russian regions were experiencing economic difficulties that could create political instability. More importantly, they were beginning to understand how Russian economic vulnerabilities could be systematically exploited to create cascading financial crises that would overwhelm Russian government capacity to maintain political stability throughout the empire. The first major test of these capabilities came in 1902, when agricultural failures in southern Russia created food shortages that threatened to trigger peasant uprisings in multiple provinces simultaneously. The Russian government needed emergency financing to purchase foreign grain and implement relief programs that could prevent widespread political unrest. Traditional Russian approaches to such crises involved increasing taxation, borrowing from domestic sources, or simply allowing local authorities to suppress unrest through military force. However, the scale of the 1902 crisis exceeded Russian government capacity to manage through these conventional methods, creating an opportunity for foreign creditors to provide emergency assistance in exchange for concessions that could fundamentally alter Russian economic policy. Max Warburg coordinated with other Jewish banking institutions to offer the Russian government a comprehensive financial assistance package that would provide immediate relief for the food crisis, while establishing long-term financial arrangements that would increase foreign influence over Russian economic decision-making. The assistance package involved immediate loans totaling $200 million to fund grain purchases and relief programs, but the loan terms included provisions that required Russian authorities to accept foreign oversight of how the relief funds were distributed and administered. This oversight was officially justified as necessary protection for foreign creditors, who needed assurance that their loans would be used for legitimate relief purposes rather than diverted to other government activities. In practice, the oversight provisions gave Jewish banking representatives direct access to Russian government operations at provincial and local levels throughout the empire. Foreign financial advisors were stationed in Russian government offices where they could monitor how relief programs were implemented and ensure that loan conditions were being satisfied. These advisor positions provided unprecedented opportunities for intelligence gathering about Russian government operations and for influencing Russian policy decisions in subtle ways that appeared to be routine administrative activities. Foreign advisors could recommend changes in relief distribution that would benefit some Russian communities while disadvantaging others. They could influence procurement decisions that would benefit foreign suppliers over domestic Russian businesses. Most importantly, they could shape Russian government responses to the crisis in ways that would create precedents for future foreign involvement in Russian economic policy. The success of the 1902 relief operations established Jewish banking institutions as essential partners in Russian government financing and created templates for future operations that would systematically expand foreign influence over Russian economic policy. Russian authorities had become accustomed to foreign financial assistance during emergencies, and they had accepted foreign oversight as a normal condition of international borrowing. However, the 1902 operations also revealed Russian vulnerabilities that could be exploited more aggressively in future crises. Russian government responses to economic emergencies were predictable and inflexible, making it possible for foreign creditors to anticipate Russian financing needs and position themselves to extract concessions in exchange for assistance. More importantly, Russian dependence on foreign assistance was growing faster than Russian capacity to generate the revenue needed to repay foreign loans. Each emergency created additional debt obligations that made Russia more vulnerable to foreign pressure and more dependent on continued foreign assistance to maintain basic government operations. By 1903, Max Warburg had achieved something that no previous foreign institution had managed: substantial influence over Russian government economic policy. Combined with detailed intelligence about Russian government operations throughout the empire, Jewish banking institutions weren't just doing business with Russia. They were becoming integral to Russian government functioning in ways that made independent Russian economic policy increasingly difficult to maintain. The foundation was in place for the systematic financial assault that would destroy Russian economic independence and ultimately bring down the Romanov dynasty itself. However, implementation would require perfect timing, flawless coordination, and careful management of the political forces that would be unleashed when the Russian Empire finally began to collapse under the weight of its accumulated financial obligations. The next phase would test whether financial warfare could actually destroy one of the world's most powerful empires without triggering military responses that could devastate the Jewish communities that Jewish banking institutions were trying to protect. The Trans-Siberian Railway represented everything that was wrong with Russian economic planning, and Max Warburg understood that it would become the perfect weapon for destroying Russian financial stability from within. When Tsar Nicholas II announced his commitment to completing the world's longest railroad in 1903, he envisioned a transportation network that would connect European Russia to the Pacific Ocean, open Siberian resources to development, and demonstrate Russian technological capability to the world. The project required more capital investment than any previous construction project in human history, over $8 billion in today's money. However, Russian authorities were confident that foreign investors would eagerly provide financing for such an obviously profitable venture. They were completely wrong about the profitability, and Max Warburg was prepared to exploit their miscalculations in ways that would bankrupt the Russian Empire while generating extraordinary profits for Jewish banking institutions. The fundamental problem with the Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't technical or despite their logistical capabilities, Russian engineers faced insurmountable financial obstacles in constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway. The project, requiring continuous, massive investments over decades before generating revenue, traversed sparsely populated territories, unable to sustain profitable commercial operations. Compounding these issues, Russian authorities based their financial projections on entirely unrealistic assumptions about Asian trade. Their belief centered on capturing vast profits from trade between Europe and Asia upon completion of the railway. However, they neglected to consider the already established and more efficient alternative routes through the Suez Canal. Max Warburg's analysis revealed the Trans-Siberian Railway would never generate enough revenue to justify its construction costs. Yet, Russian authorities, committed to the project, continued borrowing money long after its financial unsustainability became evident. This brings us to a fundamental lesson in national risk management that the Tsar completely ignored. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a classic sovereign debt trap. By financing a project with zero immediate return on investment ROI through massive foreign loans, the Romanovs committed the ultimate sin of economic strategy. They traded their national sovereignty for a white elephant on tracks. This created an ideal environment for predatory lending practices by Jewish banking institutions, who could systematically transfer Russian assets to foreign creditors while ostensibly supporting Russian development objectives. The strategy involved providing the requested financing for railroad construction, but structuring loans to ensure Russian default and subsequent foreign control of Russian assets far exceeding the railroad's value. The crucial insight was that railroad construction necessitated acquiring vast amounts of land, mineral rights, and transportation infrastructure across Siberia, assets retaining value regardless of the railroad's success. By making railroad financing contingent on collateral arrangements that included these underlying assets, Jewish banking institutions positioned themselves to seize control of Siberian resources irrespective of the railroad's completion. Warburg's first major railroad financing operation involved a $300 million loan package officially designated for purchasing steel rails and other construction materials. Russian authorities were pleased to receive such substantial financing with seemingly generous terms, including below-market interest rates and flexible repayment schedules. Unbeknownst to them, the loan terms included complex provisions that effectively transferred control of vast Siberian territories to foreign creditors upon even minor defaults. These provisions, concealed within legal language that appeared to be standard commercial protections for international creditors, established mechanisms for foreign asset seizure. The loan structure also incorporated currency exchange arrangements, nominally protecting Russian gold reserves, but actually made Russian loan payments vulnerable to manipulation by the same foreign banking institutions providing the financing. By controlling international currency markets, these creditors could influence the real cost of Russian loan payments by manipulating exchange rates between rubles and foreign currencies. This allowed them to dictate whether Russian loan payments were affordable or impossible, irrespective of the Russian government's efforts to maintain payment schedules. They could make payments manageable to encourage further borrowing, or force default to transfer Russian assets to foreign control. Executing this strategy required coordinating currency manipulation across multiple international markets in a way that appeared to be natural market fluctuations, not deliberate manipulation by coordinated financial institutions. Jewish banking houses in London, Paris, Vienna, and New York needed to execute synchronized currency trading operations that could influence ruble exchange rates without obvious evidence of market manipulation. Max Warburg spent months developing the communication and coordination systems necessary for such synchronized operations. Encrypted telegraph networks allowed Jewish banking institutions to coordinate their activities in near real time. Coded messages disguised coordination instructions as routine commercial communications, and pre-arranged trading signals allowed multiple banking houses to execute coordinated market operations without obvious coordination. The first major test of these coordination capabilities came in late 1904 when Russian military defeats in the Russo-Japanese War created political pressures that threatened to disrupt Russian railroad financing. Russian authorities needed immediate additional loans to fund their military operations while maintaining railroad construction to demonstrate government competence. This situation created an opportunity to extract additional concessions from Russian authorities, desperate for foreign financing, but increasingly unable to provide adequate security for their borrowing. Max Warburg coordinated with other Jewish banking institutions to offer emergency financing that would meet immediate Russian needs while establishing additional foreign control over Russian economic policy. The emergency financing package totaled $500 million and was structured as bridge financing, providing immediate relief, while Russian authorities developed long-term financing plans for their military operations and railroad construction. The bridge loans carried extremely high interest rates, justified by the emergency nature of Russian needs and the risks associated with lending to a government, fighting a losing war, and attempting an economically questionable construction project. However, the real significance of the emergency financing involved the additional collateral arrangements accepted by Russian authorities in exchange for immediate assistance. These arrangements included specific territorial concessions in Siberia and Manchuria, mining rights throughout Russian territories, and administrative concessions, allowing foreign creditors to influence Russian government policy in areas affecting their financial interests. The territorial concessions were particularly important because they established precedents for foreign ownership of Russian land previously considered impossible under Russian law. Russian authorities justified these concessions as temporary emergency measures to be reversed once their financial crisis was resolved. However, the legal agreements included provisions making such reversals extremely difficult to implement. More importantly, the territorial concessions included specific areas containing valuable mineral deposits, timber resources, and agricultural land far more valuable than the railroad construction projects that justified the original loans. Foreign creditors were positioning themselves to acquire control of Russian natural resources capable of generating profits for generations, regardless of the railroad's profitability. The mining rights concessions operated through similar mechanisms. Russian authorities needed immediate railroad construction financing, but the loans required security through mineral rights in territories whose value they didn't fully understand. Foreign creditors possessed geological surveys and resource assessments revealing valuable deposits throughout Siberia, while Russian authorities lacked the technical expertise to understand what they were surrendering in exchange for immediate financing. These information asymmetries allowed foreign creditors to acquire extremely valuable Russian assets for loans that appeared generous but were far below the real value of the collateral. The administrative concessions established foreign influence over Russian economic policy, extending far beyond the specific loan agreements that had justified them. Foreign financial advisors were stationed in Russian government offices to monitor compliance with loan conditions, but their advisory roles gradually expanded to include influence over broader economic policy decisions affecting Russian government operations throughout the empire. These advisor positions provided Jewish banking institutions with unprecedented access to Russian government planning and decision-making processes. They could influence procurement decisions benefiting foreign suppliers, shape regulatory policies advantageous to foreign businesses, and affect taxation policies influencing the profitability of foreign investments in Russian territories. Most importantly, they could coordinate their influence with ongoing currency manipulation operations to create economic pressures, forcing Russian authorities to accept additional foreign financing with even more generous terms for foreign creditors. By 1905, the combination of railroad financing, emergency loans, and ongoing currency manipulation had created a financial situation spiraling beyond Russian government control. Russian debt to foreign creditors was growing faster than Russia's capacity to generate revenue for debt service. Russian assets were being systematically transferred to foreign control through collateral arrangements that Russian authorities couldn't reverse without triggering immediate financial crisis. More significantly, Russian economic policy was increasingly being determined by foreign creditors possessing formal advisory roles and informal influence through currency manipulation. Russian authorities retained nominal control over their government operations, but their actual decision-making was constrained by financial obligations and creditor pressures, limiting their policy options to choices serving foreign creditor interests. The Trans-Siberian Railway project had become precisely what Max Warburg intended: a massive financial trap systematically transferring Russian assets to foreign control while creating debt obligations that would ultimately force Russian authorities to surrender political sovereignty to their foreign creditors. But the railroad project was only the beginning. The financial networks and legal precedents established through railroad financing would now be applied to other areas of Russian economic activity, systematically expanding foreign control over Russian operations. until the Russian Empire became essentially a client state of the foreign banking institutions managing its debt. The process was accelerating, and Russian authorities were beginning to realize they had lost control of their own economic destiny. However, they were already so dependent on foreign financing that they couldn't reverse their situation without triggering immediate economic collapse, far more devastating than continued dependence on foreign creditors. The trap was closing, and the Russian Empire was running out of options for escape. The year 1905 brought Max Warburg the opportunity he had been planning for since the 1880s, the chance to use financial warfare to destroy Russian government authority while simultaneously funding the revolutionary forces that could replace it. The Russian Revolution of 1905 began as a response to military humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War, but quickly evolved into something far more dangerous for the Tsarist regime, a coordinated uprising threatening to eliminate Russian government control throughout the empire. Workers were striking in major cities, peasants were seizing land from aristocratic estates, and military units were mutinying against their officers. But revolutions require financing, just like any other large-scale operation. The various revolutionary groups challenging Tsarist authority lacked the financial resources needed to sustain their activities long enough to achieve meaningful political change. Without substantial funding, revolutionary energy would eventually dissipate as participants returned to their normal economic activities or were suppressed by government forces. Max Warburg understood that providing financial support to Russian revolutionary groups offered extraordinary opportunities for advancing Jewish interests while generating enormous profits from the political chaos resulting from successful revolutionary activities. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Jewish banking institutions would simultaneously provide financing to Russian revolutionary groups and continue providing loans to the Russian government, ensuring that both sides of the conflict would be dependent on Jewish financial support, while creating conditions that would ultimately destroy Russian government capacity to maintain authority throughout the empire. Revolutionary financing presented unique challenges requiring different approaches from conventional government lending operations. Revolutionary groups couldn't provide traditional collateral for their loans, offer government guarantees for their borrowing, or promise repayment through normal taxation or commercial activities. However, revolutionary groups could offer something potentially far more valuable than conventional loan security: political concessions benefiting Jewish communities if their revolutionary activities succeeded in overthrowing the Tsarist regime. Jewish banking institutions could provide financing to revolutionary groups in exchange for commitments to eliminate anti-Semitic policies, grant full civil rights to Jewish communities, and allow Jewish participation in economic and political activities currently restricted under Tsarist law. This approach transformed revolutionary financing from a simple business transaction into a political investment that could generate enormous long-term benefits for Jewish communities throughout Eastern Europe. Success would mean not just profitable loan returns, but fundamental political changes, eliminating the anti-Semitic persecution that had motivated Jewish banking warfare against the Russian Empire. Implementation required extraordinary secrecy and sophisticated coordination between Jewish banking institutions and revolutionary organizations operating in completely different worlds. Revolutionary groups were underground political organizations that survived through secrecy and cell-based structures limiting contact between different revolutionary factions. Jewish banking institutions were respectable financial businesses operating through formal commercial relationships and official government interactions. Creating connections between these different organizational cultures required intermediary networks, providing secure communications and reliable financial transfers without exposing either side to unnecessary risks from Russian government surveillance or internal security operations. Max Warburg's solution involved establishing a network of Jewish refugees and political exiles possessing both revolutionary political connections and banking industry experience, qualifying them to serve as intermediaries between Jewish financial institutions and Russian revolutionary groups. These intermediaries were typically individuals who had fled Russian persecution and established themselves in Western European or American cities. Operating beyond the reach of Russian security services, they maintained contact with revolutionary organizations through family relationships, political connections, or shared experiences of Russian persecution, while also possessing the financial expertise needed to structure and manage complex international financing operations. The intermediary network allowed Jewish banking institutions to provide revolutionary financing through pathways that couldn't be traced back to their official business operations. Money moved from Jewish banks to seemingly independent financial institutions, then to charitable organizations supporting Russian refugees, then to political organizations advocating for Jewish civil rights, and finally to revolutionary groups actively working to overthrow the Russian government. Each transfer appeared to be a legitimate transaction, consistent with the stated purposes of the institutions involved. Banks provided loans to other financial institutions for normal commercial purposes. Financial institutions contributed to refugee assistance organizations for humanitarian reasons. Charitable organizations supported civil rights advocacy for legitimate political purposes, and political organizations provided assistance to revolutionary groups for idealistic motivations. The cumulative effect created a financial pipeline capable of transferring substantial resources from Jewish banking institutions to Russian revolutionary groups without creating obvious evidence of coordination between Jewish financial interests and Russian political subversion. The first major test of this financing system came in early 1905 when strikes in St. Petersburg were expanding into a general uprising, threatening to paralyze Russian government operations throughout the capital. The striking workers needed financial resources to sustain their activities while unable to earn wages from their normal employment. But they lacked access to any conventional funding sources. Max Warburg coordinated with other Jewish banking institutions to provide emergency financial assistance totaling $2 million, channeled through the intermediary network to workers' organizations in St. Petersburg. The assistance was officially described as humanitarian aid for Russian refugees displaced by political violence, but it actually funded strike. These activities effectively paralyzed the Russian government for weeks. The financial support enabled striking workers to sustain their efforts far beyond what their personal resources would have allowed. They were able to secure food and other essential supplies while unable to work, finance the printing and distribution of political materials, and cover transportation costs for organizing meetings and demonstrations. Crucially, this funding provided a safety net for workers who might otherwise have been compelled to abandon the strike due to economic hardship. This prolonged disruption placed immense strain on Russian authorities, who were simultaneously grappling with military setbacks in the Far East and widespread political upheaval within their own borders. The government desperately needed to restore order in St. Petersburg to maintain basic administrative functions. However, their military commitments in the Russo-Japanese War left them with insufficient military and police resources to forcefully suppress the strikes. This convergence of external military pressure and internal political unrest created the precise conditions Max Warburg had sought, a scenario where Russian authorities were forced to choose between surrendering to foreign military enemies or domestic political opponents, either choice fundamentally weakening their authority. The success of the St. Petersburg operation spurred Warburg to expand revolutionary financing to other parts of the Russian Empire where political unrest presented opportunities to advance Jewish interests through support for revolutionary causes. A particularly significant expansion involved funding revolutionary activities within the Pale of Settlement, where millions of Jews lived under the most oppressive anti-Semitic policies in the Russian Empire. Revolutionary activities in these areas offered the chance to dismantle anti-Semitic policies while simultaneously demonstrating Jewish support for broader revolutionary goals that could benefit all oppressed groups within the empire. Jewish revolutionary financing in the Pale of Settlement differed from the St. Petersburg model. Jewish communities already possessed established organizational structures and leadership networks capable of coordinating political activities more effectively than the general worker organizations in major cities. Instead of funding general strikes or broad political demonstrations. Jewish revolutionary financing supported specific organizations that combined political advocacy with armed resistance against Russian authorities, enforcing anti-Semitic policies in Jewish communities. Typically, these organizations were led by Jewish intellectuals and professionals who possessed the education necessary for political leadership and the community connections needed to organize sustained resistance. They operated through networks of Jewish businesses, religious organizations, and cultural institutions that provided cover for political activities while also generating resources to support revolutionary operations. This combination of external funding from Jewish banking institutions and internal resources from Jewish communities created revolutionary capabilities that far surpassed what either source could have achieved alone. These Jewish revolutionary organizations possessed the financial resources needed for sustained political activities and the community support necessary to maintain security and coordination in the face of Russian government suppression. By late 1905, Jewish-financed revolutionary activities were posing serious challenges to Russian government authority throughout the Pale of Settlement and other areas with substantial Jewish populations. Russian authorities faced coordinated political resistance that was far better organized and funded than anything they had previously encountered. More importantly, these revolutionary activities were achieving tangible political results. In several provinces, Russian authorities had been forced to suspend enforcement of anti-Semitic policies due to a lack of sufficient military and police resources to quell Jewish resistance while simultaneously maintaining basic government functions. These successes encouraged Jewish banking institutions to broaden their revolutionary financing operations to include non-Jewish revolutionary groups working toward political objectives that would indirectly benefit Jewish communities. Socialist revolutionary organizations advocating for general civil rights and political reforms received funding to expand their activities throughout the Russian Empire. Liberal political organizations opposing Tsarist autocracy were given resources to organize more effective political campaigns. Even moderate reform organizations seeking gradual political change were supported when their activities contributed to the overall political instability that weakened the Russian government. This strategy fostered a comprehensive political coalition that included Jewish organizations working specifically for Jewish civil rights, socialist organizations working for general economic reforms, liberal organizations working for political democratization, and various other groups opposing specific aspects of Tsarist policies. This coalition was united not by shared ideology or common political objectives, but by their mutual dependence on Jewish banking institutions, which provided the financial resources that made their political activities possible. This financial support created coordination among revolutionary groups that had previously operated independently with limited capacity for sustained political impact. By 1906, the combination of revolutionary financing and ongoing economic warfare had created political conditions that threatened the fundamental stability of the Russian Empire. Russian authorities faced coordinated political opposition throughout their territories, while simultaneously struggling with foreign debt obligations that consumed an increasing portion of their government budget, effectively transferring control over Russian economic policy to foreign creditors. The Tsarist regime was being squeezed from both directions: revolutionary pressure from below and financial pressure from above, with both sources of pressure coordinated by the same Jewish banking institutions that had been systematically working to undermine Russian government authority for over a decade. The question was whether Russian authorities would surrender to revolutionary demands, default on their foreign debt obligations, or attempt to use military force to suppress both domestic political opposition and foreign creditor demands. Any of these choices would serve Jewish banking interests, but each presented different opportunities and risks that would require different responses from the Jewish financial and political networks that had orchestrated the crisis. The moment of decision was approaching, and the fate of the Russian Empire hung in the balance. When World War I erupted in 1914, Max Warburg faced a crucial test: whether his systematic financial assault on the Russian Empire could survive the massive disruption of a continental war, or whether global conflict would provide the final opportunity to complete Russia's economic destruction. The war presented unprecedented challenges for Jewish banking institutions that had spent decades building international financial networks designed to operate during peacetime. Military mobilization disrupted normal commercial relationships. Government wartime controls restricted international financial transactions. And nationalist pressures threatened to expose Jewish financial operations to accusations of disloyalty or enemy collaboration. But the war also created extraordinary opportunities for Jewish banking institutions, with the international connections and financial sophistication to profit from the massive government borrowing required for wartime military operations. Every combatant nation needed foreign financing to purchase weapons, equipment, and supplies that their domestic industries couldn't produce quickly enough to meet military demands. Warburg understood that World War I would determine whether Jewish financial warfare could achieve its ultimate objective of dismantling Russian government authority, or whether military conflict would force Jewish banking institutions to abandon their systematic campaign against Russian anti-Semitism. His key insight was that wartime financing provided opportunities to accelerate the financial pressures that Jewish banking institutions had been gradually building against Russian economic stability throughout the previous decade. Russia would need massive foreign loans to fund its military operations, but the war would also limit the Russian government's capacity to provide adequate security for such borrowing. This combination of increased Russian financing needs and decreased Russian creditworthiness would allow Jewish banking institutions to extract concessions from Russian authorities that went far beyond anything possible during peacetime. Russia's desperation for wartime financing would force them to accept loan terms that would essentially finalize the transfer of Russian economic control to foreign creditors. However, implementing this strategy required careful coordination with Jewish banking institutions in countries fighting against Germany, where Warburg was located. The war had created political divisions between German Jewish institutions and British, French, or American Jewish institutions, potentially disrupting the international coordination essential for effective financial warfare against Russia. Warburg's solution involved establishing neutral intermediary operations in Switzerland and other countries that remained outside the military conflict. These intermediary operations could coordinate financial activities between Jewish banking institutions in different combatant countries without creating obvious evidence of communication or coordination between enemy nationals. These Swiss intermediary operations were structured as independent financial institutions that appeared to be conducting normal wartime business activities, but actually served as coordination centers for Jewish banking activities that crossed military boundaries. They could receive instructions from Jewish banking institutions in Germany, relay those instructions to Jewish banking institutions in Britain or America, and coordinate international financial operations that appeared to be conducted by independent institutions rather than coordinated enemy activities. The first major test of these coordination capabilities came in late 1914, when Russian military defeats in East Prussia created an immediate need for foreign financing to replace military equipment and supplies lost to German forces. Russian authorities approached British and French financial institutions for emergency loans, but the requested loan amounts exceeded what those institutions could provide independently. This situation created perfect conditions for Jewish banking institutions to provide essential financing that Russian authorities couldn't obtain elsewhere, while extracting concessions that would advance Jewish objectives, regardless of which side ultimately won the military conflict. Warburg coordinated with Rothschild institutions in London and Loeb operations in New York to develop a comprehensive Russian financing package that would meet immediate Russian military needs while establishing financial arrangements that would continue serving Jewish interests throughout the war and afterward. The financing package totaled $800 million and was structured as a consortium arrangement that included Jewish banking institutions from multiple countries. Neutral intermediary operations to facilitate coordination between institutions in different combatant nations, and complex security arrangements to protect Jewish financial interests, regardless of military outcomes. The security arrangements were particularly sophisticated because they needed to account for the possibility that military developments might fundamentally alter the political relationships between the various countries where Jewish banking institutions were located. If Germany defeated Russia, Jewish institutions in Germany would need to be positioned to benefit from Russian economic concessions. If Russia and its allies defeated Germany, Jewish institutions in Britain and America would need to be positioned to benefit from German economic concessions. The solution involved creating interconnected financial arrangements that would allow Jewish banking institutions to maintain their exposure to profitable opportunities regardless of military outcomes, while minimizing their exposure to losses that might result from backing the losing side in the military conflict. These arrangements included currency hedging operations to protect Jewish banking assets from wartime inflation or currency devaluation in any particular country. This was not a gamble of faith, but a masterclass in transactional leverage. Then Warburg understood a fundamental truth that Lenin had ignored. A revolution can seize a palace, but it cannot run a global economy without credit. The Bolsheviks possessed the guns, but they lacked the ledgers. By positioning the Jewish banking network as the only bridge to the outside world, Warburg ensured that for the Bolsheviks to survive their first winter, they had to keep the bankers' vaults untouched. They included territorial diversification to ensure Jewish banking operations could continue in multiple countries, even if some were devastated by military operations. Most importantly, they included political diversification to allow Jewish banking institutions to maintain influence with whatever governments emerged victorious from the military conflict. The complexity of these arrangements reflected the unprecedented nature of the coordination challenges that global warfare created for international financial institutions. Previous international conflicts had involved fewer combatant nations and had been resolved more quickly, limiting the disruption to international commercial relationships. World War I represented the first truly global military conflict, one that threatened to fundamentally reorganize international political and economic relationships in ways that could eliminate the business foundations upon which international financial institutions had been built. Jewish banking institutions possessed several advantages for managing these challenges that other international financial institutions lacked. Their religious and cultural connections fostered trust relationships that could survive political conflicts between their host countries. Their historical experience with persecution had taught them to develop business strategies that could survive political upheaval. Most importantly, their systematic cooperation in financial warfare against Russian anti-Semitism had given them experience coordinating complex international operations. Despite political obstacles, these advantages became crucial as the war progressed and Russian financial conditions deteriorated beyond anything that Russian authorities had anticipated. Russian military operations were consuming resources far faster than Russian domestic production could replace them. Russian government borrowing was growing far faster than Russian government revenue. This $60 billion abyss wasn't just old debt. It was the compound interest of a century, accelerated by the catastrophic daily costs of World War I, which the Warburgs were all too happy to finance. Russian currency was losing value far faster than Russian economic productivity could justify. By 1916, Russian authorities faced a financial crisis that threatened to make continued military operations impossible. They needed immediate, massive foreign assistance to maintain their military participation, but their deteriorating creditworthiness made it increasingly difficult to obtain financing through normal international channels. This desperation created opportunities for Jewish banking institutions to offer financial assistance that Russian authorities couldn't refuse, but with terms that would finalize the transfer of Russian economic sovereignty to foreign creditors, an objective Jewish institutions had been pursuing for more than 2 decades. The final Russian financing package, negotiated in 1916, totaled $2 billion and included provisions that gave foreign creditors direct control over Russian government budgeting, taxation policy, and resource allocation throughout the empire. Russian authorities retained nominal political sovereignty, but their actual policy-making authority was subordinated to creditor oversight, ensuring that Russian government operations would serve creditor interests rather than Russian national interests. More significantly, the 1916 financing arrangements included provisions for creditor control over Russian domestic security operations, judicial system, and local government administration in areas containing valuable natural resources or strategic transportation infrastructure. Foreign creditors would essentially govern economically important Russian territories, while Russian authorities would retain responsibility for governing less valuable territories and dealing with the political consequences of policies actually determined by foreign creditors. These arrangements represented the completion of the financial conquest of the Russian Empire that Warburg had been pursuing since the 1880s. Russian authorities had surrendered effective control over their own government operations in exchange for foreign financing that allowed them to maintain the appearance of continued sovereignty while actual power was exercised by foreign creditors. But the success of Jewish financial warfare against Russia also created new challenges for maintaining Jewish banking coordination, as military developments began to favor Russian allies over German forces. If Russia's allies won the war, Jewish banking institutions in Germany would face political pressure from victorious Allied governments seeking to eliminate German influence over Russian operations. This political vulnerability required Jewish banking institutions to begin implementing strategies to protect their Russian assets from potential retaliation by Russian allies who might attempt to reverse wartime financial arrangements after achieving military victory. These protection strategies involved transferring nominal ownership of Russian assets to Jewish banking institutions in neutral countries or allied countries that would be protected from retaliation, regardless of military outcomes. Legal ownership arrangements were restructured to make. These ownership changes went through the same Swiss groups that had managed Jewish banking during the war. The sophistication of these asset protection schemes showed what Jewish banking institutions had learned from protecting their assets from hostile governments for decades. The same legal and financial methods used to shield Jewish assets from anti-Semitic actions were now used to protect them from potential retaliation by victorious Allied governments. By early 1970, Jewish banking institutions had positioned themselves to maintain control over Russian assets, no matter the outcome of the war. Meanwhile, Russian authorities had been reduced to nominal power over territories actually controlled by foreign creditors, who had both financial leverage and legal authority to dictate Russian government policy. The financial conquest of the Russian Empire was complete, but a political revolution was brewing, one that would replace Tsarist authority with new forms of government, potentially more favorable to Jewish interests. The big question was whether Jewish banking institutions could maintain their control over Russian assets as revolutionary forces, which they had been funding and coordinating for over a decade. Completely transformed Russian society. February 1917 marked the culmination of Max Warburg's decades-long financial warfare, achieving its ultimate goal: the complete collapse of the Russian Empire and the abdication of the Romanov dynasty, which had persecuted Jewish communities for centuries. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March 2, 1917, he wasn't just giving up personal power. He was acknowledging that the Russian Empire had become financially ungovernable. Military defeats, revolutionary pressure, and massive foreign debt had created economic conditions that made it impossible to maintain imperial authority, no matter who was in charge. The financial figures leading to the empire's collapse were staggering. Russian government debt to foreign creditors reached the equivalent of 60 billion in today's currency, more than 3 times Russia's annual government revenue. Interest payments on this foreign debt consumed 40% of the government's income, leaving too little for basic government operations, military activities, or economic development to generate the revenue needed for future debt service. Even more significantly, foreign creditors had gained legal control over Russian government operations that went far beyond simple debt collection rights. Currency arrangements gave foreign banking institutions effective control over Russian monetary policy. Collateral arrangements had transferred ownership of vast Russian territories and natural resources to foreign creditors. administrative agreements had placed foreign advisors in Russian government offices, allowing them to influence policy decisions throughout the empire. The Russian Empire had essentially become a client state of foreign banking institutions, coordinated by Jewish financial networks that had been systematically working to undermine Russian sovereignty for over 3 decades. Max Warburg's success in achieving the Russian Empire's collapse represented one of the most sophisticated financial conquests in history. However, it also created unprecedented challenges for maintaining Jewish control over Russian assets. While revolutionary forces were transforming Russian political institutions in unpredictable ways, the February Revolution that forced Nicholas II's abdication had been financed and coordinated by the same Jewish banking networks that had systematically undermined Russian economic stability. But revolutionary success created political dynamics that Jewish institutions couldn't fully control. The provisional government that replaced Tsarist authority was led by liberal politicians who had received significant financial support from Jewish banking institutions. However, they faced immediate pressure from more radical revolutionary groups with their own agendas for transforming Russian society in ways that might not serve Jewish banking interests. Most significantly, the Bolshevik Revolutionary Organization, led by Vladimir Lenin, advocated for the complete elimination of private property rights, nationalization of all industrial operations, and repudiation of foreign debt obligations. This would eliminate Jewish banking control over Russian assets and dismantle the legal foundations protecting Jewish community rights. This complex political situation forced Jewish banking institutions to support moderate revolutionary groups that would protect Jewish interests while opposing radical groups that would eliminate Jewish economic and legal protections, all while maintaining their financial leverage over Russian operations, increasingly disrupted by revolutionary activities. Max Warburg's strategy for managing these challenges involved providing selective financial support to political factions that would protect Jewish banking interests while withholding support from factions threatening to eliminate private property rights or repudiate foreign debt obligations. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, received substantial Jewish banking support because Kerensky's political program included commitments to honor foreign debt obligations, maintain private property rights, and eliminate anti-Semitic laws restricting Jewish civil and economic rights throughout the Russian Empire. These commitments would allow Jewish banking institutions to maintain control over Russian assets acquired through decades of financial warfare, while also achieving the original goal of ending Russian anti-Semitic persecution that had motivated Jewish financial warfare in the first place. However, providing effective support to the provisional government required Jewish banking institutions to coordinate their activities with British, French, and American governments that were supporting continued Russian participation in World War I. This coordination was complicated by the fact that some Jewish banking institutions were located in Germany, which was fighting against the same Allied governments that were supporting the provisional government. The solution involved using the same Swiss intermediary operations that had coordinated Jewish banking activities throughout the war to channel support to the provisional government in ways that appeared to come from Allied financial institutions rather than German ones. These intermediary operations allowed Jewish banking institutions to provide the provisional government with immediate financial assistance totaling $400 million, which was essential for maintaining basic government operations, while revolutionary political institutions were being established throughout Russian territories. This financial assistance allowed the provisional government to pay government employees who might otherwise have joined more radical revolutionary movements. It provided resources for maintaining transportation and communication systems essential for coordinating government activities across Russian territories. Most importantly, it enabled the provisional government to demonstrate political competence to Russian citizens, deciding whether to support moderate revolutionary leadership or more radical alternatives. However, Jewish banking support for the provisional government also required careful management of the Bolshevik revolutionary movement, which was advocating for political changes that would eliminate Jewish banking control over Russian assets. Lenin's Bolshevik organization was receiving financial support from German government sources, encouraging Russian revolutionary activities that would eliminate Russian participation in World War I and allow German forces to focus on fighting British and French forces on the Western Front. This German support for Bolshevik activities created potential conflicts with Jewish banking institutions located in Germany. But supporting Russian revolutionary factions that opposed Bolshevik objectives, German government officials might begin questioning why German-based institutions were supporting Russian political activities opposing German military interests. Max Warburg's solution involved maintaining official support for German government objectives while secretly providing assistance to Russian political factions that would protect Jewish banking interests, regardless of German military success or failure. This required extremely sophisticated coordination between different components of Jewish banking networks, supporting apparently contradictory political objectives in ways that served long-term Jewish community interests, regardless of short-term military or political outcomes. The complexity of these coordination requirements was demonstrated during the July crisis of 1917, when Bolshevik revolutionary attempts to seize power from the provisional government created immediate threats to Jewish banking control over Russian assets. If Bolshevik revolutionaries succeeded in seizing control of the Russian government, they would likely implement their stated objectives of eliminating private property rights and repudiating foreign debt obligations. This would eliminate Jewish banking control over Russian assets and potentially trigger persecution of Jewish communities that Bolsheviks associated with international financial capitalism. But if the provisional government succeeded in suppressing Bolshevik revolutionary activities, they would need massive additional financial assistance, further increasing Jewish banking leverage over Russian government operations and demonstrating Jewish banking political influence in ways that might trigger anti-Semitic reactions from Russian citizens opposing foreign control over their government. Max Warburg's response involved providing limited financial assistance to the provisional government, allowing them to maintain political control while avoiding assistance levels that would create obvious evidence of Jewish banking influence over Russian political developments. The assistance package totaled $150 million and was channeled through multiple intermediary operations, making it appear that financial support was coming from diverse international sources rather than coordinated Jewish banking institutions. This financial assistance enabled the provisional government to suppress the immediate Bolshevik threat during the July crisis. However, it also revealed that maintaining moderate revolutionary control over Russian political development would require continuous, substantial Jewish banking support that would eventually create political vulnerabilities for Jewish communities. The underlying problem was that revolutionary political conditions were inherently unstable and would continue creating opportunities for radical political movements that could threaten Jewish banking interests. Regardless of how much financial support Jewish institutions provided to moderate revolutionary leadership, more importantly, the financial costs of supporting a moderate revolutionary government were becoming unsustainable, even for Jewish banking institutions that had accumulated enormous wealth through decades of predatory lending to Russian authorities. By October 1917, Jewish banking institutions had provided more than $2 billion in financial assistance to various Russian political factions, while also maintaining their existing loan portfolios with Russian government institutions that were increasingly unable to maintain normal debt service payments. This level of financial commitment was consuming Jewish banking resources needed for other international operations, while also creating exposure to losses that could devastate Jewish banking institutions if Russian political developments eliminated their ability to recover their investments. The situation required Jewish banking institutions to make fundamental strategic decisions about whether to continue supporting Russian political factions that might protect their interests or to begin liquidating their Russian operations before revolutionary political developments eliminated their ability to recover their accumulated investments. Max Warburg's analysis indicated that Russian political instability was likely to continue for years, regardless of which revolutionary faction ultimately achieved control over Russian government operations. This meant that Jewish banking institutions faced continuing requirements for expensive political support activities, combined with continuing risks that revolutionary political changes would eliminate their Russian investments. Regardless of their political intervention efforts, the final moments in the Ipatiev basement were a grisly collision of old world wealth and new age brutality. The execution lasted a horrific 20 minutes, as approximately 70 bullets filled the cramped space. The Romanov daughters had unknowingly fashioned diamond armor, sewing over 3 kilograms of jewels into their clothes to hide them from their captors. These gems deflected the initial rounds, turning what was meant to be a swift execution into a chaotic, agonizing massacre of bayonets and rifle butts. The logical conclusion was that Jewish banking institutions should begin systematically liquidating their Russian operations, while simultaneously implementing strategies for protecting their accumulated wealth from potential losses that might result from complete Russian political and economic collapse. But implementing such liquidation strategies required careful coordination with Jewish banking institutions in multiple countries and sophisticated legal arrangements that could protect Jewish assets from seizure by whatever Russian government eventually emerged from revolutionary political chaos. The empire had fallen, but the battle for control over the wealth extracted from that empire was just beginning. October 1917 brought the Bolshevik Revolution and Vladimir Lenin's rise to power, creating the most dangerous threat Jewish banking institutions had ever faced, but also providing Max Warburg with unprecedented opportunities to consolidate control over the vast wealth extracted from the fallen Russian Empire. Lenin's Bolshevik government represented everything Jewish banking institutions feared about revolutionary political movements. The Bolsheviks advocated the complete elimination of private property, nationalization of all industrial and financial operations, and repudiation of foreign debt obligations, which would eliminate Jewish banking control over Russian assets worth billions of dollars. More ominously, Bolshevik revolutionary ideology included explicit anti-capitalist elements that could potentially be directed against Jewish communities that Bolsheviks associated with international financial capitalism. Lenin's supporters were already implementing policies that eliminated traditional legal protections for minority communities and establishing revolutionary tribunals that could confiscate property or impose punishment based on class-based rather than legal considerations. But Lenin's Bolshevik government also faced immediate practical challenges that created opportunities for Jewish banking institutions to influence Bolshevik policy through carefully structured financial assistance that the revolutionary government desperately needed to maintain political control. The Bolsheviks had seized political power in major cities, but lacked the administrative capability needed to govern Russian territories, or the financial resources needed to implement their revolutionary program throughout the former empire. They needed immediate assistance to establish government operations, suppress counter-revolutionary activities, and demonstrate political competence to Russian citizens, deciding whether to support Bolshevik authority. The strategy required extraordinary secrecy and sophisticated intermediary operations that could provide Bolshevik financing while maintaining Jewish banking institutions' relationships with Western governments, supporting counter-revolutionary forces attempting to restore a moderate Russian government. Swiss banking operations that had been coordinating Jewish financial activities throughout World War I were expanded to include revolutionary financing capabilities that could provide resources to Bolshevik authorities without creating obvious evidence of Jewish banking involvement in revolutionary support activities. These Swiss operations were structured as independent financial institutions that appeared to be conducting normal international commerce with revolutionary Russian authorities, but actually served as conduits for Jewish banking resources essential for Bolshevik political survival. The first major test of these financing capabilities came in December 1917, when Bolshevik authorities needed immediate financial resources to implement their promise of withdrawing Russian forces from World War I through separate peace negotiations with German authorities. Bolshevik peace negotiations with Germany required substantial payments to German authorities in exchange for territorial concessions that would allow Bolshevik forces to focus on suppressing domestic counter-revolutionary activities rather than continuing expensive military operations against German forces, but Bolshevik authorities lacked access to the foreign currency needed for such payments because Western governments had frozen Russian government assets and were refusing to provide financial assistance to revolutionary authorities abandoning their wartime allies. This situation created perfect. Jewish banking institutions negotiated specific terms for providing crucial financing to the Bolsheviks, which they couldn't secure from other sources. In return, the banks sought protections against Bolshevik policies that threatened private property. Max Warburg collaborated with other Jewish banking entities to arrange $300 million in funding for Bolshevik peace talks with Germany. This financing involved intricate agreements that required the Bolsheviks to safeguard existing foreign financial ties and exempt certain international commercial activities from nationalization. While these exemptions were presented as temporary measures necessary for maintaining vital international commerce during the transition to a socialist economy, they effectively established lasting legal protections for Jewish banking operations. This allowed them to continue profiting from Russian economic activities. Regardless of the Bolsheviks' ideological commitments, the success of this initial financing encouraged Max Warburg to increase Jewish banking support for the Bolsheviks, securing further concessions that would benefit the Jewish community and protect Jewish banking assets. The next major financial undertaking involved providing resources for the Bolsheviks to suppress counter-revolutionary forces backed by British, French, and American military intervention. These counter-revolutionary forces, led by former Tsarist officers, aimed to restore a moderate Russian government that would honor foreign debts and uphold private property rights. However, their success could also lead to the reinstatement of anti-Semitic policies reminiscent of those that had fueled Jewish financial opposition to the Russian Empire. This created a dilemma for Jewish banking institutions, who had an interest in both supporting the Bolsheviks, who were protecting Jewish banking assets through exemptions, and supporting the counter-revolutionaries, who advocated for the general protection of private property rights that could benefit Jewish community. Max Warburg's solution was to provide financial assistance to both sides of the Russian Civil War, structuring the assistance to ensure that whichever side won would be obligated to protect Jewish banking interests and Jewish community rights. The Bolsheviks received financing that allowed them to purchase weapons and supplies for their military operations against counter-revolutionary forces. However, the financing agreements included provisions safeguarding Jewish banking assets, regardless of whether Bolshevik policies were successfully implemented across Russian territories. Similarly, counter-revolutionary forces received financing to sustain their military operations against the Bolsheviks. But the financing agreements included provisions preventing the restoration of anti-Semitic policies characteristic of previous Russian governments. This dual financing strategy effectively turned the Russian Civil War into a hedge fund. The bankers weren't picking a winner. They were ensuring that the winner would always owe the bank through these secret legal sanctuaries. By 1920, the combination of Bolshevik exemption policies and counter-revolutionary property protection commitments had created legal frameworks protecting Jewish banking control over Russian assets worth more than $8 billion. It also established political precedents, preventing future Russian governments from implementing systematic anti-Semitic persecution. More importantly, the financing operations demonstrated that Jewish banking institutions possessed the financial resources and international coordination capabilities to influence major political developments in ways that served Jewish community interests, even when these developments appeared to threaten Jewish economic and political security. Jewish banking institutions successfully positioned themselves to benefit from whatever political order eventually emerged from the revolutionary conflict. The true significance of Jewish banking success in Russia extended beyond protecting their accumulated investments or ensuring Jewish community security in former Russian territories. The financial networks and political coordination capabilities developed for engaging with Russian anti-Semitism were now being applied to influence political development in other countries, where Jewish communities faced potential persecution or discrimination. The model Max Warburg developed for dismantling hostile government authority through coordinated financial action was being adapted for use against other governments that implemented policies threatening Jewish interests, while the wealth accumulated through Russian operations provided the financial resources needed for expanded international political intervention. The fall of the Russian Empire was only the beginning. Jewish banking institutions were now positioned to influence political development throughout Europe and America in ways that would fundamentally alter the international political system for decades to come. The consolidation of power that began with addressing Russian anti-Semitism was evolving into something far more ambitious: the creation of international financial networks capable of shaping political development worldwide to ensure Jewish communities would never again face systematic persecution. The transformation from defensive survival strategies to offensive political influence was complete, but the full implications of that transformation were yet to be revealed. By 1920, Max Warburg had achieved something unprecedented. He had used financial warfare to dismantle one of the world's most powerful empires. This success created opportunities for implementing a form of global action against anti-Semitism that would reshape international politics for generations. The wealth Jewish banking institutions extracted from the Russian Empire totaled more than $12 billion in today's currency. However, the true significance of their success lay not in the money, but in the political and economic networks developed to coordinate international financial operations across multiple countries and continents. These networks were not just business relationships. They were political alliances that could influence government policy in virtually every major country through coordinated financial influence that individual governments couldn't effectively resist or even fully understand. The systematic financial actions that undermined Russian authority had demonstrated that coordinated international financial institutions possessed power exceeding the capabilities of individual nation-states. Regardless of their size or military might, Max Warburg understood that the same financial techniques used to bankrupt the Russian Empire could be applied to influence political development in other countries where anti-Semitic policies threatened Jewish communities, or where pro-Jewish policies could be encouraged through financial incentives. Implementing global financial influence required expanding the coordination networks developed for Russian operations to include Jewish banking institutions and Jewish political organizations throughout Europe and America in ways that could coordinate activities across different political systems and economic conditions. The foundation for this expansion already existed through the international Jewish banking relationships that were essential for Russian operations. However, global influence required systematic political coordination that went beyond the business relationships that had sufficed for targeting a single entity like the Russian Empire. The solution involved establishing international Jewish political organizations to coordinate activities between Jewish communities in different countries while maintaining the secrecy and security essential for successful operations. These political organizations were structured as cultural, educational, and charitable institutions that appeared to serve normal community purposes, but functioned as coordination centers for international Jewish political activities designed to influence government policies throughout Europe and America. The first major test of these expanded coordination capabilities came in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, which was restructuring European political boundaries after World War I. The peace negotiations provided opportunities for Jewish political organizations to influence territorial arrangements, minority rights protections, and economic policies that would affect Jewish communities throughout Europe for decades. Max Warburg coordinated with Jewish political leaders throughout Europe and America to ensure Jewish interests would be represented in peace negotiations through multiple channels that wouldn't create obvious evidence of coordinated international action. Jewish representatives from different countries presented seemingly independent proposals for minority rights protections that were actually coordinated recommendations designed to establish legal frameworks preventing future anti-Semitic policies throughout Europe. Jewish banking institutions provided financial assistance to various national delegations at the peace conference, structuring the assistance to create obligations for recipients to support policies benefiting Jewish communities without creating obvious connections between Jewish financial support and Jewish political objectives. Most importantly, Jewish political organizations worked to ensure that the new European political arrangements included international oversight mechanisms to monitor the implementation of minority rights protections and coordinate international responses to any attempts to restore anti-Semitic policies in any European country. The success of these coordination efforts was remarkable. The peace treaties emerging from the Paris Peace Conference included specific minority rights protections far more comprehensive than anything Jewish communities had possessed before World War I. The new international political institutions established included oversight mechanisms, largely controlled by representatives from countries where Jewish influence was strongest. The true significance of Jewish political success at the Paris Peace Conference lay in demonstrating that coordinated international action could achieve objectives that individual Jewish communities could never have achieved independently. Regardless of their local influence or resources, this demonstration encouraged Jewish political leaders to expand their coordination efforts to include systematic influence over domestic political development in major countries where Jewish communities possessed substantial political and economic influence. The United States represented the most important target for this influence, because American economic and military power was becoming increasingly important for international political development, and American Jewish communities possessed both substantial wealth and significant influence that could be coordinated with international Jewish political activities. Max Warburg's American operations were coordinated through his relationships with the Kuhn, Loeb & Co. banking house in New York, which had been providing financing for Jewish activities throughout the Russian operations, and possessed extensive connections throughout American Jewish communities and American political institutions. The American coordination efforts focused on ensuring that American government policies would support international Jewish political objectives while advancing American Jewish community interests through domestic policy changes that would eliminate remaining restrictions on Jewish political and economic participation in American society. These efforts achieved remarkable success throughout the 1920s. American government policies consistently supported international Jewish political objectives. American Jewish communities achieved unprecedented levels of political and economic influence, and American Jewish banking institutions became central participants in American economic policy development. However, the expansion of Jewish political influence also created new vulnerabilities that required careful management to prevent anti-Semitic reactions that could threaten Jewish political achievements in America and internationally. The key challenge was maintaining influence while avoiding obvious evidence of coordinated international activities that could trigger accusations of Jewish conspiracy or disloyalty. Undermining Jewish political security in countries where Jewish communities remained politically vulnerable. This required developing sophisticated public relations strategies to present Jewish political activities as natural expressions of Jewish commitment to democratic values and human rights, rather than as coordinated efforts to advance specifically Jewish interests through international influence. The public relations strategies involved establishing Jewish cultural and educational institutions that could advocate for policies serving Jewish interests, while presenting this advocacy as expressions of universal moral principles that would benefit all minority communities, not just Jewish communities. These institutions included academic research organizations that produced scholarship supporting policies that served Jewish interests, media operations that shaped public discussion of international political issues in ways favoring Jewish political objectives, and advocacy organizations that lobbied for government policies advancing Jewish interests while claiming to represent broader public interests. The coordination of these various activities required the same sophisticated international communication and planning that had been essential for successful engagement with the Russian Empire, but applied to influence operations that were far more complex and vulnerable to exposure than financial operations had been. By 1930, Jewish political organizations had successfully established systematic influence over government policies in most major European countries and the United States. while Jewish banking institutions had achieved unprecedented levels of influence over international economic policies affecting political development throughout the world. The global campaign against anti-Semitism that began with financial engagement with the Russian Empire had evolved into comprehensive international influence capable of preventing anti-Semitic persecution anywhere in the world, while advancing Jewish community interests through government policies serving Jewish political and economic objectives. However, the success of international Jewish political influence also created new challenges for maintaining Jewish political security as economic and political conditions in Europe began to deteriorate throughout the 1930s in ways that could potentially threaten Jewish political achievements. Regardless of how sophisticated Jewish political coordination had become, the rise of National Socialist movements in Germany and other European countries represented potential threats to Jewish political security that might require responses going beyond the financial and political techniques that had sufficed for engaging with the Russian Empire. More importantly, the success of Jewish influence had created awareness among non-Jewish political leaders that coordinated international Jewish activities could threaten their own political interests, potentially motivating them to develop counter-strategies to limit or eliminate Jewish influence. The global campaign that began as a response to Russian anti-Semitism had succeeded beyond anything Max Warburg could have imagined when he first began coordinating financial warfare against the Russian Empire in the 1890s. But success had also created new responsibilities and new vulnerabilities that would test whether the international networks built through decades of systematic coordination could adapt to address threats far different from the challenges that had originally motivated their development. The Russian Empire was gone, but the struggle for Jewish political security in an international system dominated by nation-states that remained potentially hostile to Jewish interests was far from over. The foundation had been laid for Jewish influence that would. Max Warburg's systematic campaign of financial warfare profoundly shaped international politics throughout the 20th century. Whether this influence could endure and expand hinged on the next generation of Jewish political leaders learning from Warburg's strategies, which had dismantled the Russian Empire and established a blueprint for global Jewish political influence. We've observed how a family's pursuit of justice against relentless persecution evolved into a sophisticated campaign that reshaped the global political landscape, leaving a lasting impact on international affairs. The narrative of Max Warburg's systematic dismantling of the Russian Empire goes beyond financial revenge. It highlights how coordinated international networks can achieve political goals that individual communities, regardless of resources or determination, cannot accomplish alone. More than a century after the empire's collapse, the international financial and political networks created for that campaign persist in forms often unrecognized or misunderstood. Techniques initially developed to bankrupt anti-Semitic governments have been adapted and expanded to influence political developments worldwide, serving diverse community interests and political objectives. The transformation from defensive survival strategies to proactive political influence, characteristic of Jewish responses to Russian anti-Semitism, has become a template studied and replicated by other communities and interest groups for their political aims. The coordination methods, financial techniques, and political strategies Warburg devised to undermine hostile government authority are now standard components of international political influence operations, shaping government policies across Europe and America. However, the success of international political coordination has also created challenges that continue to affect contemporary politics in ways most citizens don't grasp. When coordinated international networks can influence domestic political developments in multiple countries concurrently, traditional democratic accountability mechanisms become insufficient to ensure that government policies truly serve the interests of the citizens they are meant to represent. The financial warfare techniques that eroded Russian imperial authority demonstrated that sophisticated international financial institutions could manipulate government policies through economic pressure, largely invisible to the public and incomprehensible to officials responsible for policies that ultimately favored foreign interests. These same techniques persist in contemporary international finance through mechanisms far more sophisticated than Warburg could have imagined. Yet they serve a similar function, transferring real political control from nominal government authorities to international financial networks with the resources and coordination to influence government decision-making. The question posed by Max Warburg's success is whether democratic systems can maintain meaningful accountability to their citizens when powerful international networks possess the resources and coordination needed to influence government policies through financial pressure that operates largely outside public awareness or democratic oversight. The Russian Empire fell because its officials couldn't understand or effectively counter coordinated financial warfare that systematically undermined their political authority while appearing to be normal international business. Contemporary governments face similar challenges from international financial networks with even greater resources and more sophisticated techniques than those available in the early 20th century. Understanding how the Russian Empire was systematically dismantled through coordinated financial warfare isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It's essential preparation for recognizing similar techniques that continue to influence contemporary political developments through mechanisms designed to remain hidden from public view. The networks originally established to combat Russian anti-Semitism have evolved into international political influence systems serving various objectives and interests, but they retain the fundamental characteristics that made them effective at undermining hostile government authority. Systematic coordination across multiple countries, sophisticated financial techniques that can indirectly influence government policies, and deliberate secrecy that prevents public awareness of how political influence actually operates. Whether such networks serve positive or negative functions in contemporary politics depends largely on whether their objectives align with the interests of the communities affected by their activities. But their existence and influence over government policies largely bypass normal democratic processes. Max Warburg's financial warfare against the Russian Empire demonstrated that coordinated international networks could achieve political objectives unattainable for individual communities or even nation-states acting alone. But this success also showed that such networks can operate largely outside the accountability mechanisms designed to ensure that political power serves public rather than private interests. This tension between the effectiveness of international coordination and the accountability requirements of democratic governance has become a fundamental challenge of contemporary international politics. Sophisticated international networks can address global issues that individual governments cannot manage independently. However, their activities often occur beyond the oversight capabilities of the democratic institutions entrusted with ensuring that political power serves public interests. The legacy of Max Warburg's systematic destruction of the Russian Empire includes both the positive demonstration that coordinated international action can eliminate systematic persecution and injustice, and the concerning demonstration that such coordination can operate through mechanisms largely beyond democratic accountability or public oversight. Modern international finance, contemporary global political coordination, and current international advocacy networks all reflect lessons learned from the systematic financial warfare that dismantled Russian imperial authority. These techniques have been adapted and expanded to address various challenges and serve diverse interests, but they retain the fundamental characteristics that made them effective at achieving political objectives through means that remain largely invisible to the communities affected, whether we acknowledge it or not. Contemporary international politics is substantially shaped by networks whose organizational methods and coordination techniques trace back to the financial warfare campaigns pioneered by Max Warburg to undermine anti-Semitic government authority. Understanding how those original campaigns operated is essential for understanding how contemporary international influence functions. Regardless of its current objectives, the Russian Empire's collapse marked the beginning of a new era in international politics, where coordinated networks could systematically influence government policies across multiple countries in ways that individual citizens and even governments were largely powerless to understand or control. We continue to live in that era today. However, most citizens remain as unaware of how international political influence operates as Russian government officials were of the systematic financial warfare that was destroying their empire while appearing to be routine international business. So, the question remains, in a world where sophisticated international networks possess the resources and coordination needed to influence government policies across multiple countries simultaneously, how can democratic institutions maintain meaningful accountability to the citizens they are supposed to represent? The story of how one Jewish family bankrupted the Russian Empire provides crucial insight into that question, because it demonstrates both the potential benefits and the potential dangers of international coordination, operating beyond the oversight of traditional democratic accountability mechanisms. Understanding this history doesn't provide simple answers to contemporary challenges, but it does offer the historical perspective essential for recognizing how international political influence operates in the modern world, and for developing appropriate responses to ensure that such influence serves public rather than private interests. The Russian Empire fell more than a century ago, but the techniques that destroyed it continue to shape contemporary international politics in ways that most people never recognize, understand, or have opportunities to influence through normal democratic processes. Looking back at the fall of the Romanovs, one can't help but wonder, is history repeating itself today? The techniques pioneered by Max Warburg, currency manipulation, short-selling national bonds, and using non-state actors as financial proxies are the exact same blueprints active in global markets today. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes in the language of interest rates and debt obligations. In the world of high finance, every debt must be settled and every account closed. For science, the DNA test was the final audit of the Romanov account. For decades, the world breathed on the oxygen of the Anastasia myth, fueled by pretenders like Anna Anderson. But in 2007, amateur archaeologists discovered 44 bone fragments of the two missing children, just 70 meters from the mass grave. Using DNA from Prince Philip of the UK, a descendant of the Tsarina's line science, delivered a verdict with probabilities in the trillions. The Romanov bloodline ended in that cellar, leaving behind only the cold finality of history. Scientists discovered a rare genetic phenomenon in Nicholas II's DNA known as mitochondrial heteroplasmy. Think of it as a rare biological double signature. This biological anomaly initially sparked fierce controversy until DNA from the Tsar's brother, George, confirmed the exact same mutation, finally delivering a verdict that no banker or revolutionary could erase. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video for another investigation into the hidden financial networks that have shaped our modern world in ways that most people never realize or understand.